Okay, now you have most of the tools you'll need to understand the use of indexes. But before we go on, I want to point out that just because you use an index doesn't mean it's used efficiently. So certain types of operators, for instance, $greater than and $less than, may use an index but not use it efficiently because they may still require the inspection of a lot of documents. So you can say $greater than 3, and maybe that's half the collection. And so it uses the index, but it's still very slow. Other things that might not use the index, or if they use it inefficiently, are not equals, or not in, or doesn't exist. All of these negative operators are difficult because they need to inspect every element to see if it satisfies the criteria, and it might return a large result. Also, when you're searching on regexes, if you don't give something that is stemmed on the left part of the field, it's slow. So if you say I want to search for A, B, C, D, that really can't use the index because it needs to go through it. We don't have a way to do that full text search. If on the other hand you say stem it A, B, C, D on the leftmost part of the string, then it can use it and it will use it. All right, let me give you an example where the first order information may be a little bit misleading. Let's go back to our students collection. I built two of these collections. This one has 10 million documents in it and quite a few indexes on it. That's a document in the collection. You can see it's got a student ID and a class ID and some scores. And there's more than one record for each student. There's a record for each class. And let's look at the indexes on it. Oops. We look at the indexes on it. We see there's a healthy number of indexes on it. We have one on underscore ID, one on class ID, one on student ID, one on student ID, comma class ID. All good. Now let's do a query that is reasonably selective, but isn't going to be very fast. And in particular, let's look at finding all the students with a student ID greater than 500 who are in class 20. There isn't that many documents to satisfy this criteria. And then let's sort it by student ID and explain it. Now if we do that, we can see that it's pretty slow. It took 3.6 seconds. It used the student ID class ID index. Now that turns out to be not the best choice because it had to scan, even though it only returned 20,000 documents, it had to scan, it looks like 1.3 million index items, and that is a lot. So it did not use the most efficient index, and you can understand why. If you use the student ID index, and I deliberately choose a student ID that was somewhere in the middle, half the records had student IDs greater than that. And so it was going to be very inefficient to do that. But on the other hand, if I hint it and I say, you know what, use the class ID index. And I know there aren't that many students in each class because I built this data set, so I have information it doesn't necessarily have. And it's the same query. It's going to use the class ID data set, and then it's going to have to just manually figure out which ones of the student IDs are greater than 500, but it's still going to be a lot better. Wow, that was a lot better. So you can see here it took 133 milliseconds, and it scanned 20,000 objects here, and number of you don't see any number bigger than that here. So the index entries, number of scanned, it looks like it was about the same. So much more efficient to use this class ID index, even though the class and the student ID was specified. And the reason is that the way we were using that student ID index was with one of these operators greater than 500, greater than, not a particularly efficient operator to use with an index. So just keep in mind when you're thinking about indexing and whether or not that it's using an index, that you have to consider more than just whether an index was used, but also how it was used. Was it only used for the sort? Was it used in an inefficient manner that caused the database to still look through millions of records? All these things are important when it comes to final performance.